Prime Minister Narendra Modi's recent visit to Canada marked a significant geopolitical moment that sent a strong message not only to separatist movements like Khalistan, but also to the state-sponsored narratives driven by Pakistan. Welcomed warmly by newly appointed Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, this visit symbolized a major diplomatic reset and demonstrated how India's evolving foreign policy under Modi is reshaping international perceptions and alliances. One of the most important outcomes of the visit was the visible softening of tensions between India and Canada. Relations had soured under former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, particularly due to the presence and political space given to pro-Khalistani separatists within Canada. Modi's trip, however, was handled with strategic finesse. Instead of confronting the issue with aggressive rhetoric, the Indian government utilized subtle but firm diplomatic channels to signal its red line. The very fact that Prime Minister Carney welcomed Modi with open arms sent a message that Canada was ready to recalibrate its approach to this sensitive issue. This visit served as a direct counter to the Khalistani agenda. For years, extremist elements within the Sikh diaspora in Canada had been propagating a separatist ideology, often supported by disinformation and anti-India sentiment. Modi's diplomatic strategy effectively undercut these efforts by engaging directly with Canadian leadership and emphasizing the importance of tackling extremism in all its forms. His presence and the stature he commands made it clear that India was not going to tolerate foreign soil being used to destabilize its sovereignty. In doing so, India also made a distinction between the average Sikh Canadian, many of whom are law-abiding, patriotic individuals, and the small, radicalized minority that uses religion and ethnicity as a political weapon. At the same time, the Pakistani state narrative, which has long attempted to sow discord by supporting both overt and covert anti-India activities abroad, took a serious hit. Pakistan's long-standing strategy of internationalizing internal Indian issues, especially Kashmir and Khalistan, has seen diminishing returns, especially as its own credibility continues to erode globally. By diplomatically engaging with Canada and showing restraint while being firm, India further exposed how Pakistan's backing of extremist ideology lacks legitimacy and is increasingly out of sync with international priorities such as stability and counterterrorism. Modi's approach disarmed many of the typical Pakistani talking points by focusing on shared democratic values and global cooperation. A major turning point in this diplomatic shift was the overwhelming support shown by the Indian diaspora in Canada. Across multiple cities, Indian Canadians rallied in support of Modi's visit. This was not a state-organized or controlled show of strength, but rather a genuine display of alignment with the message of unity, progress, and national integrity. The visual power of these crowds made it evident that separatist ideologies like Khalistan do not enjoy majority support within the Indo-Canadian community. Instead, the diaspora chose to showcase its loyalty to both its adopted homeland and its cultural roots, rejecting divisive identity politics in favor of mutual respect and integration. The reception Modi received from Prime Minister Carney further underscored the transformation underway in Canada's foreign policy. Carney, known for his pragmatic and economics-driven worldview, seems poised to rebuild diplomatic bridges that had been strained during Trudeau's tenure. This welcoming gesture not only signaled a thaw in political tensions, but also indicated a deeper realization within Canada that engaging with India, one of the world's largest democracies and fastest-growing economies, is in its national interest. The change in tone from Ottawa suggests a new approach based on mutual respect, economic cooperation, and shared concerns over extremism. One of the most effective tools in Modi's strategy was narrative control. Unlike traditional diplomacy, which often happens behind closed doors, this visit was accompanied by strategic media engagement, use of social media, and symbolic gestures that emphasize transparency, confidence, and strength. India didn't just respond to the narratives pushed by Khalistani sympathizers, it redefined the discussion itself. By putting forward a vision of growth, stability, and unity, Modi ensured that extremist voices were pushed to the margin. This reframing of the issue removed the false equivalence that often arises in Western media between freedom of expression and incitement to violence. India also used this opportunity to push for greater transparency and cooperation in tracking foreign interference in extremist financing. Discussions reportedly included intelligence sharing mechanisms and the need for both countries to confront the use of their soil for cross-border terrorism and radicalization. Modi's government has long maintained that freedom of speech must not be used as a cover for hate speech and sedition, and this visit gave India a platform to amplify that message on an international stage. Canadian authorities are now under greater pressure to investigate and act against individuals and organizations with proven links to extremist ideologies or foreign intelligence networks. The entire diplomatic episode reinforced Modi's stature as a leader not limited by borders. His ability to navigate complex issues without resorting to confrontation, but still holding firm to national interest, showcases the evolving nature of Indian foreign policy. Modi represented a confident, self-assured India, an India that commands respect, not merely demands it. His ability to reset relations with Canada while simultaneously delivering a blow to both Pakistani propaganda and Khalistani extremism illustrates why he is increasingly being seen not just as India's leader, but as a global statesman. Through this visit, India showcased a new kind of power, one that doesn't rely on coercion or loud declarations, but on clarity, conviction, and composure. In doing so, it not only neutralized two hostile narratives, but also laid the foundation for stronger partnerships in the years to come. A significant dimension of Prime Minister Modi's visit to Canada was how it directly confronted and weakened the growing influence of the Khalistani separatist agenda, particularly within certain sections of the Canadian Sikh diaspora. For years, the Khalistan movement, a secessionist ideology that seeks to create an independent Sikh state by carving out a part of India's Punjab, had found a sympathetic base among a small but vocal group of expatriates in countries like Canada, the UK, and the US. In Canada especially, some of these individuals were able to operate under the guise of civil liberties, pushing separatist ideologies that openly challenged India's sovereignty and incited violence against Indian institutions. The former Canadian administration under Justin Trudeau was often criticized for its leniency and political opportunism, especially in relation to the Khalistan issue, largely due to its dependency on Sikh votes in key ridings. Modi's strategic approach was not just about raising a political objection. It was about systematically dismantling the legitimacy of the Khalistani narrative at the diplomatic, public, and narrative levels. First, by choosing to visit Canada during a time when tensions had previously escalated due to the issue, Modi signaled that India would no longer avoid engagement, but rather confront the issue head-on. His presence in the country, not in a defensive or confrontational mode, but in one of quiet authority, was itself a challenge to separatist groups who had falsely claimed to represent the will of the diaspora. Through private and public conversations, Modi conveyed that India distinguishes between ordinary Sikh Canadians, many of whom are proud of both their Indian heritage and Canadian identity, and the radical few who abuse democratic freedoms to incite unrest back in India. Modi's engagement with the Indian-Canadian community further weakened Khalistani influence by visibly demonstrating where the majority stands. At his public events, thousands of people, including Sikh Canadians, turned out in support, waving the Indian flag, chanting slogans of unity, and celebrating India's democratic and cultural heritage. These images and videos went viral across media platforms, challenging the long-standing narrative that Khalistani sentiments are representative of the broader diaspora. It was now clear that the majority of the community rejects extremism, and this public show of support played a crucial role in shifting the optics and perception internationally. In addition to public diplomacy, Modi's government has also been quietly working to expose the financial and ideological links between Khalistani groups and hostile foreign powers. Intelligence exchanges and discussions during the visit reportedly touched on foreign-funded radicalization and the misuse of nonprofit or religious organizations as fronts for extremist propaganda. By presenting evidence and data, India pressed the point that the issue is not about freedom of expression, but about foreign interference and domestic radicalization. The framing of the issue in terms of terrorism, national security, and foreign influence resonated with the new Canadian leadership under Prime Minister Mark Carney, who is known for his pragmatic and institutional approach. Equally important was the subtle pressure placed on the Canadian establishment to act. While Modi did not engage in public rebukes or dramatic accusations, the diplomatic tone was unmistakably firm. The message was clear. If Canada wishes to maintain strong economic, strategic, and political ties with India, it must demonstrate seriousness in addressing India's security concerns, especially when those concerns involve threats emanating from Canadian soil. With India's increasing influence in global trade, technology, and geopolitics, ignoring those concerns is no longer a cost-free option. The result was a visible marginalization of Khalistani voices during Modi's visit. Notably, protests against his arrival were scattered, disorganized, and largely ignored by the mainstream media. Unlike previous visits when opposition was highly visible and sometimes violent, this time the public space was dominated by unity, support, and celebration. The Modi administration succeeded in showcasing that the Khalistani narrative is a fringe ideology, not a mass movement, and that India will actively confront and isolate such movements globally. This strategic and multi-layered approach, involving soft power, diaspora engagement, diplomatic firmness, and public narrative control, ensured that the Khalistani influence was not just countered, but decisively weakened in a country where it once seemed to be growing unchecked. One of the most significant outcomes of Prime Minister Modi's diplomatic visit to Canada was the clear weakening of Pakistan's long-standing anti-India narrative, especially in relation to separatist movements like Khalistan. For decades, Pakistan has pursued a dual-track foreign policy, one that speaks the language of diplomacy on the global stage, while simultaneously supporting financing and providing safe havens to extremist and separatist elements that seek to destabilize India from within. This has included consistent support for Khalistani militants in the past, along with ongoing attempts to internationalize internal Indian issues such as Kashmir and Punjab. Canada, with its large South Asian diaspora and liberal democratic framework, had been one of the more fertile grounds for Pakistan's influence operation. However, Modi's visit, its outcomes, and the broader strategic recalibration signaled a decisive pushback against this model of proxy hostility. The Pakistani narrative, particularly with respect to promoting India as an oppressive state toward its minorities or as a country with festering internal divisions, took a direct hit. Modi's engagement in Canada was centered around messages of unity, democracy, and mutual cooperation, not only between governments, but also between people. This undercut the rhetorical and ideological foundation of Pakistan's global messaging, which often attempts to portray India as a fractured or unjust society. The optics of thousands of Indians, including Sikhs, Hindus, Muslims, and others, enthusiastically supporting their prime minister in Canada, sent a loud visual contradiction to Pakistan's propaganda. Furthermore, Pakistan's continued reliance on Khalistani groups as geopolitical tools was diplomatically exposed through this visit. India used high-level discussions to convey intelligence-based insights on how some anti-India elements in Canada receive ideological and sometimes financial support from across the border in Pakistan. These discussions were not just about suspicion or broad accusations. They involved documented instances, data, and joint intelligence input that reinforced India's long-standing warnings. When these matters are raised at the highest levels of diplomatic engagement, particularly in one-on-one talks between leaders, they are far more difficult to ignore or downplay. In this way, Modi's visit didn't just counter the separatist message, it implicated its overseas enablers and questioned the motivations of nations like Pakistan that profit from regional unrest. Another important element was the shifting perception of India in Western capitals. Under Modi's leadership, India is increasingly being seen as a reliable partner in the Indo-Pacific region, a stabilizing democratic force, and a country with significant economic and strategic leverage. In contrast, Pakistan is viewed by many Western governments as a country struggling with internal instability, economic collapse, and a complicated relationship with terrorism. In this context, Pakistan's attempt to undermine India's image using the Khalistan movement or minority rights discourse seems less credible and more like a diversion from its own domestic failures. Canada's new leadership under Prime Minister Carney appears to understand this evolving geopolitical calculus and is more inclined to align with India's democratic model and counter-extremism narrative than to indulge legacy ideology inherited from past political alliances. By centering the visit around dialogue, shared prosperity, and combating global extremism, Modi smartly avoided falling into the trap of reactive diplomacy. Rather than respond directly to Pakistani provocations or inflammatory claims, India used the opportunity to elevate the level of discourse and thereby isolate its detractors. The focus was on India's growing global role, not on defending against every accusation. This is a key aspect of modern diplomacy, controlling the narrative not by attacking every opponent but by rising above them and leading the conversation forward. In this regard, Pakistan's narrative suffered not because of a direct refutation, but because it became irrelevant in the face of India's confident diplomacy and growing stature. Pakistan also found itself increasingly cornered in terms of soft power and cultural influence. The same diaspora that Pakistan has tried to influence with sectarian narratives came out in strong numbers to support Modi, reaffirming their identity with a unified, progressive India. Cultural events, Indian business forums, academic interactions, and tech collaborations during the visit further underscored India's growing reach and soft power, in sharp contrast to Pakistan's shrinking credibility on the international stage. When a country like India uses its diplomatic engagements to talk about economic development, youth empowerment, and regional cooperation, and another country remains stuck in religious or ethnic antagonism, the global audience quickly sees the difference. Modi's visit to Canada did not need to even mention Pakistan explicitly for its effects to be felt. The diplomatic pressure, the exposure of foreign links to separatist movements, and the emphasis on India's unity and growth served to disarm Pakistan's narrative completely. The country's traditional tools, disinformation, diaspora manipulation, and separatist sponsorship were rendered ineffective against a larger strategy that combined public diplomacy, intelligence cooperation, and cultural outreach. This moment also signaled a broader shift in how the world views regional disputes. The West is increasingly aligning itself with countries that are democratic, economically resilient, and firm against extremism. And in this geopolitical contest, Modi's India is gaining the upper hand, while Pakistan finds its influence diminishing by the day. One of the most visible and impactful elements of Prime Minister Modi's visit to Canada was the overwhelming support displayed by the Indian diaspora, particularly in contrast to the marginal presence of pro-Khalistani protesters. This show of support was not just a symbolic gesture of loyalty toward a national leader, it represented a profound rejection of separatist ideologies by the wider Indian-Canadian community, including a significant number of Sikh Canadians. This public sentiment served as a major rebuttal to the narrative that pro-Khalistan voices hold wide influence or legitimacy among the diaspora. Instead, it became clear that such extremist factions are limited in number, over-amplified by social media, and often disconnected from the broader aspirations of Indian-origin Canadians who value peace, integration, and democratic progress. Throughout Modi's visit, large-scale gatherings were organized in Toronto, Vancouver, and other major cities where thousands of Indian Canadians from diverse regional, linguistic, and religious backgrounds came together to welcome the Prime Minister. These gatherings featured Indian flags, cultural performances, and placards bearing messages of national unity, pride, and appreciation for India's rise on the world stage. The visual power of these events cannot be overstated. In international diplomacy, optics often precede policy. The images and videos of a united diaspora celebrating India's leadership and growth contrasted sharply with the much smaller, scattered protests organized by pro-Khalistani groups who attempted but failed to dominate the public discourse during the visit. This public display of unity served to correct a long-standing misconception perpetuated in international media and political circles, that large swathes of the Indian diaspora are sympathetic to the Khalistan cause. In reality, the Indian diaspora in Canada is overwhelmingly law-abiding, educated, economically successful, and invested in the values of both Canadian democracy and Indian national identity. Many Sikh Canadians have been vocal in their opposition to extremist ideologies, emphasizing that Sikhism and separatism are not synonymous and that attempts to hijack their identity for political purposes are deeply offensive. Modi's reception in Canada helped amplify these moderate voices and expose the false binary that has often been used to divide the diaspora along political lines. Moreover, the support from the diaspora carried political significance beyond symbolism. It sent a clear message to both Canadian authorities and global observers that the Indian community in Canada, one of the largest and most influential immigrant communities in the country, is aligned with the idea of a united India and rejects any attempt to sow division from foreign soil. This message is particularly important to Canadian policymakers who in the past have sometimes hesitated to take a firm stance against separatist groups for fear of political backlash. The diaspora's public rejection of these ideologies gave Canadian leaders the social and political space to reevaluate their approach without fearing alienation from the broader community. It's also important to note that Modi's popularity among the diaspora is not merely emotional or nationalistic. Many Indian Canadians credit his government with stabilizing the Indian economy, improving international relations, and elevating the global image of India. For members of the diaspora, especially first and second generation immigrants, India's rise under Modi is a source of personal pride. It reflects not only on the country they left behind, but also on their identity in their adopted homeland. Supporting Modi for many is equivalent to supporting India's emergence as a global power, a sentiment that transcends partisan politics. This moment also exposed the failure of pro-Khalistani groups to offer a constructive or forward-looking vision. While they often rely on historical grievances and exaggerated claims of oppression, their inability to mobilize mass support during Modi's visit demonstrated their lack of relevance in the current geopolitical and social context. Their rhetoric based on division and victimhood contrasts sharply with the aspirational, inclusive vision promoted by the wider diaspora, one that looks toward progress, integration, and cooperation rather than fragmentation. The Indian government has long recognized the value of the diaspora as a force multiplier in its international relations. Modi's visit reaffirmed this strategy. His public speeches included direct acknowledgments of the diaspora's contributions to both India and Canada, emphasizing shared values, entrepreneurship, and the importance of cultural diplomacy. In turn, the diaspora responded with enthusiastic endorsement, turning what could have been a contentious visit into a celebration of cross-border unity. In a broader sense, the diaspora's support during the visit helped reinforce India's soft power. When the world sees Indians abroad standing together peacefully and proudly affirming their identity, it creates a powerful narrative that India is not just a rising nation, it is a cohesive, respected community with global presence. That soft power is vital, especially in countries like Canada, where public opinion can shape foreign policy. By organizing and mobilizing peacefully, the diaspora helped shift public perception of India from a country under internal tension to a nation unified by its diversity and confident in its leadership. Indian diaspora in Canada played a critical role in countering separatist narratives, demonstrating to both Canadian and global observers that the Khalistan movement does not represent the broader Indian community. Their enthusiastic reception of Prime Minister Modi reflected a commitment to national unity, international diplomacy, and a progressive, globally connected vision of India. Through this display, the diaspora not only supported a political leader but affirmed their own identity as citizens of a shared future, one that values inclusion over division and cooperation over extremism. The warm welcome extended by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi signaled a significant shift in Canada's diplomatic posture toward India, especially in comparison to the strained relationship that existed under former Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. This change was not simply about ceremony or optics. It reflected a deeper recalibration of Canada's foreign policy priorities, particularly regarding how it engages with India's concerns about extremism, foreign interference, and separatist movements like Khalistan that have found space in parts of the Canadian political landscape. Under Trudeau, India-Canada relations had experienced a notable decline. Despite Canada's large and economically influential Indian diaspora, Trudeau's administration was often seen as appeasing fringe elements within the Sikh community for domestic political advantage. This included instances where pro-Khalistani separatists were given undue space to operate under the guise of freedom of speech, including public rallies, parades glorifying extremists, and the reluctance of Canadian authorities to act decisively against individuals or organizations linked to extremist ideology. India had repeatedly raised these issues, both privately and publicly, but Trudeau's government remained hesitant to address them, fearing political backlash from specific voter blocs. By contrast, Prime Minister Carney's engagement with Modi reflected a pragmatic and balanced approach. Carney, a former central banker with a reputation for economic competence and institutional leadership, understands the geopolitical value of a strong relationship with India, not only as a trade partner, but also as a regional power that upholds democratic values and can help counterbalance authoritarian influences in Asia. His decision to host Modi with diplomatic dignity and attentiveness sent a strong signal that Canada, under his leadership, intends to engage with India as a serious strategic partner, not just as a source of diaspora votes or investment. This shift is particularly important in the context of the Khalistan issue. Carney's administration appears more willing to acknowledge that separatism, especially when it crosses the line into extremism or foreign-influenced agitation, poses a threat not just to India's national security, but also to Canada's own social cohesion. Modi's visit provided a platform for both countries to quietly realign their cooperation on security, intelligence sharing, and the monitoring of radicalized groups that operate under the cover of nonprofit or religious organizations. This change in tone from avoidance and denial to acknowledgement and potential action marked a breakthrough in what had previously been a stalemated relationship. The diplomatic gestures during Modi's visit were not just symbolic but strategic. Joint statements, back-channel discussions, and the respectful tone adopted by the Carney administration all indicated a desire to move beyond the gridlock of the past. While there may not have been explosive headlines or dramatic policy announcements, seasoned observers understood that something far more valuable was happening: the quiet rebuilding of trust between two democracies that had for too long talked past each other on crucial issues of security and sovereignty. Carney's approach is also reflective of the evolving global context. As India gains increasing influence on the world stage, through its G20 presidency, growing economic clout, and central role in the Indo-Pacific, Western nations are recalibrating their diplomatic strategies to align with this new reality. Canada is no exception, with trade diversification becoming a national priority following supply chain shocks and geopolitical tensions. Strengthening ties with India makes both economic and strategic sense. Modi's visit, therefore, was not just about repairing old damage, but about laying the groundwork for a forward-looking, mutually respectful partnership. This pivot was also appreciated by the Indian government, which has long emphasized reciprocity and mutual respect in its foreign engagements. Modi's administration has consistently maintained that India is open to close relationships with like-minded countries, provided its internal affairs, sovereignty, and security concerns are treated seriously. The tone of his visit and the welcome from PM Carney signaled to India that Canada is now willing to listen more carefully and act more responsibly. This bodes well for future cooperation, not just in the realm of security, but in areas like education, technology, immigration, and trade. In a broader sense, the embrace of Modi by Prime Minister Carney also had a sobering effect on Khalistani and Pakistani lobbying efforts. Their ability to frame India as an aggressor or a violator of minority rights depends heavily on sympathetic governments in the West. With Canada's leadership becoming more balanced and less ideologically driven, that platform is shrinking. Pro-Khalistan groups in particular rely on political ambivalence or passive support from host countries to maintain visibility. When a leader like Carney shows he is not willing to be manipulated by these groups and is ready to work directly with India, it removes the political cover under which such factions operate. Prime Minister Carney's welcome of Modi wasn't just about protocol. It was a public demonstration of political maturity and diplomatic pragmatism. It acknowledged India's global importance, recognized the risks of ignoring extremist threats, and reopened a channel for constructive engagement. This moment marked the beginning of a new chapter in Indo-Canadian relations, one grounded not in appeasement or ideological virtue signaling, but in mutual interest, shared democratic values, and respect for sovereignty. For India, it was a validation of its long-standing concerns. For Canada, it was a step toward restoring credibility as a partner that treats friends with seriousness and fairness. One of the most masterful aspects of Prime Minister Modi's visit to Canada was India's strategic control of the public narrative, a move that not only neutralized the impact of hostile propaganda, but also reshaped global perceptions around issues like Khalistani, separatism, and bilateral diplomacy. In an age where public perception often shapes political outcomes as much as policy itself, India demonstrated its growing capacity to manage not only diplomatic dialogue, but also the international media and political narrative. Rather than entering Canada on the defensive, responding to allegations, controversies, or extremist provocations, the Indian delegation took a proactive, composed, and dignified posture. The Indian government did not dwell on grievances or engage in reactive rhetoric against either separatist movements or former Canadian political missteps. Instead, the visit was framed around themes of cooperation, progress, and partnership. Modi's speeches and public appearances highlighted shared democratic values, economic opportunities, cultural exchange, and the power of the Indian diaspora. This forward-facing message created a stark contrast between India's vision of growth and unity and the divisive rhetoric of Khalistani sympathizers and Pakistan-backed propaganda outlets. By focusing on positive engagement and diplomacy, Modi's team successfully moved the conversation away from the accusations and narratives that anti-India groups have worked hard to promote internationally. For years, groups pushing the Khalistan agenda had relied on a media environment that was either unaware of or unwilling to challenge their exaggerated claims. They manipulated Western liberal discourses around minority rights and civil liberties to gain sympathy, often obscuring the fact that their ideologies were rooted in sectarianism, historical revisionism, and even violent extremism. However, during Modi's visit, those narratives were drowned out, not through censorship or confrontation, but through strategic oversaturation of more powerful unifying messaging. A critical component of this narrative shift was visual optics. The scenes of large, diverse Indian-Canadian crowds enthusiastically welcoming Modi made global headlines and dominated social media. Images of unity, celebration, and national pride spoke louder than any editorial or diplomatic statement. These visuals effectively countered the long-cultivated image of a deeply divided Indian diaspora. They made it difficult even for critics to argue that Khalistani voices had any mass legitimacy. India successfully used the power of the crowd to reflect the strength of consensus and national cohesion. Equally important was the calm restraint displayed by the Indian leadership in the face of minor, predictable disruptions. Isolated protests and attempts to provoke controversy by fringe elements were met with dignified silence rather than aggressive rebuttal. This discipline and messaging sent a clear signal that India would no longer allow its diplomatic agenda to be hijacked by hostile actors or radical voices. By not giving attention to provocateurs, Modi's team denied them the media oxygen they crave, a media-savvy tactic that many Western governments themselves use in managing public relations during sensitive visits. Beyond visuals and media, India also employed back-channel diplomacy to reinforce its narrative. Strategic briefings with Canadian officials, community leaders, and international stakeholders were aligned with India's central message that peace, prosperity, and cooperation are incompatible with tolerating extremist ideologies that promote division and violence. In meetings with Canadian leadership, the Indian delegation emphasized the costs of turning a blind eye to foreign-funded radicalization, not only for India but for Canada's own multicultural stability. This pragmatic approach shifted the conversation away from ideological binaries and toward practical concerns of law, security, and national interest, a framing that resonates more powerfully with Canadian policymakers than appeals to emotion alone. India also worked to create diplomatic alignment with other Western nations during the visit. In the lead-up to and during Modi's time in Canada, Indian officials coordinated messaging with Indian embassies in the US and Europe, regions where similar issues around Khalistani activity persist. This created a unified front and a consistent message. India welcomes criticism and debate, but draws a firm line against separatism, foreign interference, and incitement to violence. By demonstrating this clarity, India gained moral credibility while pushing its partners to reconsider their previous ambivalence toward these issues. Another element of narrative control was India's adept use of digital diplomacy. Indian officials, diaspora influencers, and even international journalists were engaged via social media platforms to shape the real-time discourse around the visit. Strategic hashtags, clips of speeches, diaspora testimonials, and culturally resonant content flooded platforms like X, formerly Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. In the battle of narratives where immediacy and virality matter, India not only competed but dominated, leaving anti-India voices largely outshouted and factually cornered. This exercise in narrative management reflects a deeper maturity in India's foreign policy under Modi's leadership. India is no longer satisfied with merely stating its position behind closed doors. Instead, it seeks to own the narrative in public spaces and foreign media and within the minds of global citizens. This is not just about reputation, it is about asserting legitimacy, clarifying values, and setting the terms of engagement. In this visit, India did all three. Prime Minister Modi's visit to Canada marked a defining moment in narrative diplomacy. By framing the discussion on its own terms, emphasizing unity, partnership, and progress, India sidelined fringe voices, exposed extremist narratives as marginal, and reshaped how Canada and the global community perceive India's stance on separatism. The success of this narrative strategy wasn't merely rhetorical. It set the groundwork for more focused bilateral cooperation, delegitimized extremist actors, and established India as a nation that not only acts with strength, but speaks with purpose. Another critical dimension of Prime Minister Modi's visit to Canada was the emphasis India placed on the issue of foreign interference and the covert financing of extremist networks, particularly those supporting separatist ideologies like Khalistan. This issue, long a source of tension between New Delhi and Ottawa, was handled by the Indian side not with confrontation but with strategic clarity and evidence-based diplomacy. The visit provided India with a valuable platform to highlight its national security concerns and push for stronger international mechanisms to curb extremist financing, ideological radicalization, and the exploitation of liberal democracies by transnational anti-India elements. For years, India has maintained that separatist movements like Khalistan have not survived on grassroots support, but rather have been sustained through external financial, ideological, and political backing, much of it originating from outside India's borders. In countries such as Canada, the United Kingdom, and the United States, certain religious or so-called human rights organizations have served as soft covers for funneling money, propaganda, and even logistical assistance to extremist groups. These organizations often operate under legal protection provided by liberal democracies, invoking freedom of speech, religion, and assembly, but in practice they exploit these freedoms to promote sectarianism and anti-India activities, including glorifying terrorism, promoting disinformation, and inciting communal hatred. During high-level meetings with Canadian leadership, India reportedly presented classified intelligence and financial evidence showing the connections between Khalistani figures in Canada and foreign entities, some with direct or indirect ties to hostile governments and intelligence agencies. This information is critical because it reframes the conversation from one about domestic protest or civil liberties to one about international law enforcement, counterterrorism, and transnational criminal financing. India's message was simple but firm. While peaceful dissent is a democratic right, covert foreign funding for separatist activities constitutes a breach of sovereignty and a national security threat, not just for India, but for the host countries that unknowingly harbor these networks. This strategy placed the Canadian government, now led by Prime Minister Mark Carney, in a position where it could no longer ignore the issue or treat it as a fringe concern. India framed the conversation around the growing global consensus on combating foreign interference, especially following Western experiences with election meddling, online radicalization, and foreign-funded disinformation campaigns. By linking India's own security concerns with broader Western anxieties, Modi's administration increased the diplomatic weight behind its demand. This was no longer just about India asking for justice. It was about countries working together to protect democratic institutions and prevent radical ideology from taking root under their own legal protection. The Indian delegation also pushed for more formalized mechanisms of cooperation, including joint monitoring of suspicious nonprofits, better intelligence sharing between agencies, and stricter scrutiny of organizations that have repeatedly hosted or honored individuals linked to extremism. Modi's government made it clear that passive tolerance of such activities or a policy of looking the other way for political expediency was no longer acceptable in an era where domestic radicalization can have global consequences. This narrative also gained traction with Indian Canadian citizens who have grown increasingly frustrated with the misuse of their religious or cultural identities by radicalized elements. Many moderate Sikh, Hindu, and Muslim community leaders in Canada have spoken publicly about how their places of worship, festivals, and community organizations have been infiltrated or co-opted by divisive figures. Modi's diplomatic push helped to validate these concerns at the highest level, giving voice and legitimacy to those within the diaspora who feel alienated by the presence of aggressive, politicized actors in their communities. An important aspect of India's argument was that foreign-funded extremism doesn't stop at speeches and protests. It often feeds into organized crime, smuggling, cyber warfare, and even recruitment into global terror networks. India has long tracked the overlap between Khalistani networks and narcotics trade routes, arms smuggling, and money laundering. These linkages make the issue not just a matter of ideological tension, but one of global law enforcement and counterterrorism. The Canadian government, under pressure to modernize its foreign interference laws, appeared more receptive to this framing than under previous administrations. Another strategic move on India's part was its ability to separate the issue of foreign-funded extremism from religious or ethnic identity. Modi's government carefully avoided portraying this as an issue with the Sikh community at large. Instead, it focused on the manipulation of religious identity by foreign powers and the damage it does to the integrity of both India and Canada. This diplomatic subtlety allowed Canada to engage more openly in conversation without being accused of targeting any one community, something that had previously paralyzed political will due to fears of domestic backlash. India's long-term goal is not only to isolate and discredit Khalistani extremism, but to build an international framework where such threats are treated with the same seriousness as other forms of terrorism and foreign interference. In Canada, Modi's visit opened the door to that possibility. The diplomatic emphasis on shared responsibility, mutual trust, and actionable intelligence laid the groundwork for a deeper Indo-Canadian partnership in counter-extremism efforts. Modi's visit effectively internationalized India's domestic security concerns in a way that made them relevant to Canada's national interest in broader global security discussions. By exposing the networks, funding streams, and ideological manipulation involved in modern separatist movements, India pushed the conversation from protest to protection of sovereignty, democratic values, and international order. This was not just a diplomatic success, it was a strategic repositioning that forced the issue of foreign interference into the mainstream of Indo-Canadian relations.
Prime Minister Modi's visit to Canada and the broader strategic outcomes it achieved not only addressed immediate concerns around separatism and bilateral tensions, but also served to reinforce his image as a confident global leader, one who is increasingly seen as shaping, not merely reacting to international developments. Modi's engagement during this visit exemplified the hallmarks of a 21st century statesman, commanding soft power, maintaining firmness on national interests, and articulating a vision that connects domestic priorities with global partnership. As a result, this diplomatic episode added further weight to India's emergence as a key player in the evolving world order.
Unlike many past visits by Indian leaders to the West, which were often defined by defensive posturing or requests for investment and aid, Modi's approach was distinctly different. He came to Canada not as a guest seeking support, but as the representative of a rising power with its own strategic assets, priorities, and diplomatic expectations. His posture was measured but resolute. He did not ignore past frictions, but neither did he dwell on them. Instead, he elevated the conversation to one about cooperation, growth, security, and democratic alignment. This shift in tone from reactive diplomacy to assertive engagement was noted both in political circles and international media, reinforcing the idea that India under Modi is no longer just a regional actor, but a nation with global ambitions and the capacity to fulfill them. A defining feature of Modi's global leadership style is his ability to maintain a strong nationalist foundation while simultaneously advocating for global cooperation. This dual posture was clearly on display during his Canada visit. On the one hand, he remained unequivocal about India's sovereign red lines, be it on foreign interference, extremism, or the misuse of diaspora platforms. On the other hand, he reached out to Canadian leadership with a vision of partnership rooted in shared democratic values, economic complementarity, and mutual respect. This balance between assertiveness and openness is what gives Modi credibility on the world stage. He is seen as someone who defends his country's core interests while still operating within the frameworks of diplomacy and multilateralism. The visit also highlighted the effectiveness of India's soft power, a key ingredient in any global leadership profile. Modi's ability to draw large multicultural diaspora crowds in Canadian cities was not merely a domestic political asset, it was a demonstration of India's global cultural footprint. These gatherings, filled with symbols of Indian identity and national pride, showed the world that India's influence extends far beyond its borders, not through coercion or propaganda, but through community, culture, and shared aspirations. When thousands of people voluntarily rally around a visiting leader in a foreign country, it sends a powerful signal that India commands respect, not only from governments, but from people. International observers increasingly view Modi as the embodiment of this new India, ambitious, self-confident, and increasingly influential in global affairs. His successful navigation of challenges, from managing the G20 presidency and handling multipolar alliances to standing firm against both Chinese and Pakistani provocations, has contributed to the perception that he is among a small group of global leaders shaping the post-COVID, post-Ukraine geopolitical order. His visit to Canada furthered this narrative by demonstrating that he can take a diplomatically delicate situation such as the Khalistan issue and use it to reset relations, reaffirm principles, and strengthen India's global standing. The visit added to the perception of Modi as a pragmatic deal-maker. By securing a more cooperative tone from Canadian leadership and pushing for future collaboration on security and economic development, Modi showed that his foreign policy is not just rhetorical, it delivers tangible results. This practicality, combined with principled diplomacy, aligns with how other influential world leaders, such as those from the US, Japan, and France, have come to view India as a reliable partner in areas ranging from defense and tech to climate and migration. Another factor reinforcing Modi's global leadership image is the growing alignment between India's domestic transformation and its international posture. India is no longer seen merely as a country with internal development challenges, but increasingly as a nation whose policies, digital infrastructure, innovation, space, healthcare are being studied and even emulated by other emerging economies. Modi, as the architect of many of these initiatives, is naturally associated with India's progress, making him a symbol of modern Indian aspiration, both at home and abroad. Perhaps most importantly, Modi's Canada visit showed that India no longer seeks validation from Western powers, it seeks equality. This posture resonates well with many countries in the global South, who see in India a nation that has retained its independence in foreign policy, stood its ground on difficult global issues, and refused to be drawn into ideological blocs. Modi's ability to project this balance of sovereignty and globalism has helped India position itself as a bridge builder between the developed and developing worlds, a vital role in a fragmented international system. Modi's visit to Canada was far more than a bilateral engagement. It was a statement of India's place in the world. It showcased Modi not only as the elected leader of the world's largest democracy, but as a strategic thinker capable of turning diplomatic strain into opportunity, defending his nation's core interests without isolationism, and inspiring global respect through cultural pride, strategic clarity, and political maturity. The visit strengthened India's global narrative and Modi's personal brand as a decisive, future-oriented, and globally respected leader, the face of a rising India.